$50 is enough if I skip the juice boxes, the little girl said, and the pawn shop went so quiet even the ticking wall clock sounded too loud. Nia Brooke stood on the worn rubber mat near the counter, both hands resting on the handlebars of a faded red Schwinn that looked too big for her and too beloved to be here. She was 9 years old, small for her age, with neat braids tied back by a ribbon that had started to fray at the edges, and she was trying very hard to sound older than she was. Outside, a February wind pushed trash along the curb and rattled the glass door hard enough to make the silver bell above it tremble. Inside, the air smelled like dust, cold metal, and old wood polish. Mr. Kaplan, the owner, looked from the bike to the girl and back again. He was in his 60s, with thick glasses and a grey cardigan buttoned wrong, and he had seen people sell wedding rings, trumpet cases, army watches, and once a sewing machine with dried flower petals still caught in the treadle. But he had never liked seeing children walk in with something they clearly loved. He crouched beside the bike and spun the front wheel gently. The tire gave a soft hiss against the stand. He touched the handlebar grip, worn smooth where small hands had held it through summers and school mornings and grocery runs. There was a chipped white sticker on the frame and a little silver bell by the right brake, scratched but still attached. "You sure this is yours to sell, sweetheart?" he asked, not unkindly. Nia swallowed. Her fingers tightened on the rubber grip for just 1 second before she let go. "Yes, sir," she said. "My mom knows it's mine." That was not the whole truth, and the weight of it sat in her chest like a stone, but she kept her chin level anyway. Mr. Kaplan rose slowly. "This bike is worth more than 50. Nia glanced at the shelf behind him where a row of lunch coolers sat beside used backpacks and a stack of board games with torn corners. Then she looked back at him with a seriousness no child should have needed to learn. "50 is enough," she said. "I did the math." The old man exhaled through his nose. Somewhere deeper in the shop, a space heater clicked on with a low hum. Near the front window, a tall white man in a navy wool coat paused with a velvet watch box in his hand. He had come in 5 minutes earlier, quiet as snow, to ask about the value of a vintage timepiece from his late father's estate, and until that moment he had not looked up from the glass display case. Now he did. Edward Whitmore was used to people making room when he entered a space. He was used to voices changing around him, to eager smiles, to polished shoes crossing marble floors. But the girl's voice had none of that in it. No performance. No plea. Just certainty. Mr. Kaplan leaned both palms on the counter. "What do you need $50 for?" For the first time, Nia hesitated. Her eyes dropped to the bike, to the red paint dulled with age, to the silver streamers her father had tied on the handles years ago when he taught her how to balance in the cracked church parking lot 3 blocks away. She could still remember his laugh when she wobbled too hard, the shape of his shadow running alongside her, the sound of his sneakers scraping pavement as he promised he wasn't letting go yet even when he already had. The memory came fast and sharp, and she pressed it down before it could reach her face. "Some kids need food," she said simply. "And one of them needs an inhaler refill." Mr. Kaplan's brow furrowed. "Kids from school?" Nia nodded. "From the motel on Fulton. The little ones." Her voice softened on that last part. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded sheet of notebook paper, creased into quarters and smoothed so many times it had gone soft. She opened it on the counter. There were careful numbers in pencil, written in a child's hand trying hard to be neat. Bread. Peanut butter. Apples. Milk. Socks. Juice boxes crossed out. Medicine circled twice. Mr. Kaplan stared at the list for a moment longer than he meant to. So did Edward Whitmore from across the room. The heater hummed. The bell over the door shivered in the wind. And in the middle of that small Baltimore pawn shop, under a buzzing fluorescent light that made everything look a little tired, a little washed out, a 9-year-old girl stood beside the only bike she had ever owned and waited to see whether kindness would cost exactly what she thought it would. Mr. Kaplan did not answer right away. He picked up the pencil list with 2 fingers, reading each line as if the numbers might change if he looked long enough. Bread. Peanut butter. Apples. Milk. Socks. Medicine. Nothing extra. Nothing sweet except the juice boxes she had crossed out herself. When he looked up again, Nia was standing exactly where she had been, shoulders small inside her brown coat, trying not to look at the bike too much. That was what struck him most. Children usually clung to hope with their eyes. They stared at the thing they did not want to lose as if wanting could stop the loss. But Nia was doing something harder. She was already saying goodbye. Mr. Kaplan cleared his throat and reached beneath the counter for the cash drawer. The metal slid open with a tired scrape. He counted out 2 20s and 1 10, then paused, fingers resting on the bills. "You know," he said, "I could give you store credit instead." "Stretch it farther." Nia shook her head. "The corner market does not take store credit." Her answer came fast, not rude, just practical. The old man gave a faint nod, like he respected that. He laid the money on the counter, but when Nia reached for it, he placed his hand gently over the bills. "Tell me one thing first," he said. "Why this bike?" Her eyes moved to the red frame before she could stop them. For a moment the shop faded around her. The heater hum became summer cicadas. The grey window light became a yellow evening sky over cracked blacktop. She saw her father again, tall and smiling in a faded Orioles cap, jogging beside her while she pedaled in crooked starts down the church parking lot on Carey Street. He had painted the old Schwinn himself after finding it rusted behind a neighbor's row house. He sanded the frame on a Saturday, humming under his breath, and let Nia choose the color from a line of spray cans on a shelf at the hardware store. Red, she had said, because red looked fast even when standing still. He had laughed and told her that was the smartest thing he had heard all week. Later he tied silver streamers to the handlebars with careful knots that would not slip in the wind. Nia had ridden that bike to school, to the library, to the church food drive, and once all the way to Druid Hill Park with her father jogging beside her until he had to stop and catch his breath, laughing like he was fine even when he was not. After he passed, the bike became more than a bike. It was the last thing in the world that still felt like one of his hands on her back. Nia blinked and came back to the pawn shop. "My dad gave it to me," she said quietly. Mr. Kaplan's expression softened at once. "Then maybe you should keep it." Nia looked at the list again. "Noah cannot keep wheezing," she said. "And Lily said they only had crackers left. So I already decided." Across the room, Edward Whitmore set the velvet watch box down without opening it. He had spent half his life in rooms where people talked about generosity in polished language over catered lunches and auction paddles and donor walls. He had funded hospital wings, scholarship dinners, holiday toy drives photographed under bright lights. Yet nothing in those rooms had ever sounded like a child saying, with complete calm, that she had already decided to lose the thing she loved because another child needed to breathe. Mr. Kaplan slowly removed his hand from the money. Nia gathered the bills with both hands and folded them into the notebook paper so they would not slip from her coat pocket. Then, very carefully, she reached toward the handlebars one last time. She touched the silver bell with the side of her thumb. It gave the faintest click, not a ring, more like a memory clearing its throat. She did not cry. That almost made it worse. "Can I take the bell?" she asked. Mr. Kaplan nodded at once. She twisted the tiny screw loose with focused fingers, dropped the bell into her pocket, and zipped it shut. Outside, a city bus groaned past, spraying dirty slush along the curb. Nia turned toward the door, the paper list tucked in one pocket, the money in the other, and the absence of the bike already following her like a shadow. As she stepped out into the cold, Edward watched the glass door close behind her and saw the red Schwinn standing alone under the buzzing light, its front wheel still gently spinning. Edward Whitmore did not touch the watch box again. For several seconds after Nia stepped into the cold, he stood in the pawn shop with one gloved hand resting on the glass case, looking at the door as if something important had just left through it and had not made a sound doing so. Mr. Kaplan slid the red Schwinn toward the back wall and covered it loosely with a canvas cloth, a gesture that felt more respectful than practical. "You know her?" Edward asked at last. His voice was low, polished, the kind people usually turn toward. Mr. Kaplan shook his head. Only from the neighborhood. Little girl comes in sometimes to look at the used books. Never asks for anything. Edward glanced toward the window. Through the thin film of city salt on the glass, he could see Nia halfway down the block already, walking fast with her chin tucked against the wind. She looked even smaller outside, swallowed by brick storefronts, bus exhaust, and the hard grey light of late winter. She said something about a motel, Edward said. Mr. Kaplan nodded once. Maple Crest on Fulton. Families there fall between the cracks. Too poor for one thing, not poor enough for another. Happens every day in this city. Edward gave a faint, almost absent nod. He was a man people described as decisive, but the truth was he often paused longest when something reached him in a place money could not organize. On paper, his day was already full. At noon he was due downtown for a planning lunch about the Whitmore Foundation Winter Radiance Gala, a black tie fundraiser with hand-cut crystal centerpieces, donor speeches, and a silent auction that would almost certainly raise another $2 million for youth services. His assistant had emailed him 3 versions of the seating chart before breakfast. A chef had been flown in from New York. A string quartet had been booked. There would be photographs of generosity by dessert. And yet all Edward could think about was a 9-year-old girl crossing out juice boxes in pencil so another child could have medicine. He reached into his coat pocket, set a business card on the counter for the watch he no longer cared to discuss, and said, "Keep the bike off the floor for a day or two." Mr. Kaplan studied him over the top of his glasses. "Why?" Edward looked back toward the door. "Because I am asking." Outside, the wind bit through wool and leather and carried the smell of wet pavement, fried onions from the deli on the corner, and diesel from a city bus pulling away. Edward stepped onto the sidewalk just in time to see Nia waiting at the crosswalk, one hand pressed to the pocket where she had hidden the money, the other curled around the little silver bell inside her coat. The pedestrian signal changed. She crossed Fulton Avenue in quick, careful steps and headed toward a narrow corner market with faded posters in the window advertising milk, lottery tickets, and prepaid phone cards. Edward did not call out. He followed at a distance, far enough not to startle her, close enough not to lose sight of the brown coat and the ribbon at the end of her braid. The market was warm and overcrowded, its aisles narrow, its fluorescent lights too bright for the weather outside. A radio near the register played old soul music low under the hum of refrigeration units. Nia moved through the store with the focus of someone shopping against time, not temptation. She did not pause at the candy rack or the chips stacked in glossy colors. She went first to the bread, checking the price tags twice. Then peanut butter. Then a gallon of milk she struggled to lift from the cooler but managed with both hands and a set jaw. She chose a bag of apples, not the shiny expensive kind, just the bruised discount ones bundled in clear plastic. In the pharmacy aisle she stood on tiptoe to reach a small over-the-counter inhaler spacer kit hanging near the top row, then carried it carefully like it was made of glass. Edward stopped near a display of Consoup and watched her compare the cost of thick white socks in a 3-pack against the cheaper 2-pack on the lower hook. She chose the 3-pack, then put back the apples, then picked the apples up again after staring at the list in her hand for almost 10 seconds. At the register, she unfolded the notebook paper and smoothed it flat with both palms, checking off each item with a tiny golf pencil the cashier kept by the lottery slips. The milk, bread, socks, peanut butter, apples, and medicine covered nearly everything. When the cashier announced the total, Nia opened her hand and counted each bill slowly, lips moving without sound. She had $3.14 left. She looked once toward a small refrigerated case of juice boxes near the counter, then lowered her eyes and asked instead, "How much for the bananas that are turning brown?" The cashier blinked, then said, "I can give you 6 for $1." Nia smiled for the first time all morning, small and bright and gone almost at once. Edward stood still beside the soup cans, something inside him shifting in a way that felt uncomfortably close to shame. Nia left the market with 2 thin plastic bags cutting into her fingers and a gallon of milk pressed against her coat like a block of ice. The wind had sharpened by then, sliding between buildings and down the narrow streets in long, mean gusts that made her eyes water. She shifted the bags from one hand to the other and kept walking east toward Maple Crest Motel, her sneakers darkening at the toes from slush and old salt. Behind her, Edward Whitmore exited the store a few moments later and crossed to the opposite side of the street, keeping pace without making it obvious. The motel sat half a mile away on a tired stretch of Fulton where the sidewalks cracked around dead winter grass and the neon signs seemed to buzz even in daylight. Maple Crest had once tried to look cheerful. That much was visible in the faded turquoise paint still clinging to the railings and the plastic flower boxes mounted beneath second-floor windows. But the flowers were gone now, the paint had peeled in long curled strips, and the vacancy sign near the office flickered so weakly it looked embarrassed to still be trying. Nia stepped through the front gate like she belonged there. That was the first thing Edward noticed. Not like a visitor. Not like someone arriving to do a good deed and leave feeling noble. She moved like a child returning to a place where people were waiting for her. Room 112 had a towel shoved beneath the door to keep out the draft. Nia set the milk down carefully, balanced the bags against her leg, and knocked 3 times in a rhythm that sounded familiar. There was a pause, then the door opened 2 inches and Lily Price peered out, all wide eyes and dry winter skin, her dark curls pulled into a ponytail that had come loose in the back. She could not have been more than 10. The moment she saw Nia, something in her face lifted. "You came back," she whispered, like maybe she had not let herself trust it. Nia smiled and pushed the door open with her shoulder. "I said I would." The room behind Lily was small even by motel standards, lit by a lamp with a yellow shade that made everything look tired but gentle. One bed was unmade. The other had been neatly straightened, probably by Lily. A little folding table by the window held a cracked cereal bowl, a spoon, and a stack of school worksheets. Near the heater, which clicked and sighed without giving much warmth, sat Noah Price wrapped in a grey hoodie too big for him, his knees tucked close to his chest. He was 7, thin as a cattail, with solemn eyes and the pale look children get when their bodies have spent too many nights working hard just to keep going. The minute he saw the paper bag in Nia's hand, he sat up straighter. "Did you get bananas?" he asked. Nia lifted the bag a little. 6 of them. And they were on sale because they had freckles. Noah almost smiled. Lily stepped aside and closed the door fast to keep the cold out. Nia set everything on the bedspread and began unpacking it one item at a time with the care of someone laying out treasure. Bread first. Then peanut butter. Then apples. Then the socks, white and thick and still held together with a paper band. Lily touched those before anything else. Not greedily. More like disbelief. "These are new," she said, rubbing the soft cotton between her fingers. Nia nodded. "I know." Noah watched her pull out the spacer kit and the small over-the-counter breathing medicine, and his whole posture changed. Not excitement exactly. Relief. The quiet kind. That slips in before a child knows enough words to name it. "This is for me?" he asked. Nia knelt so she was eye level with him. "Yes. But Lily has to help you use it the way the pharmacist showed me." Lily came closer at once, listening hard while Nia repeated the instructions in slow, careful steps, tapping the plastic chamber lightly with her finger. Outside the room, a siren wailed somewhere far off, then faded into traffic. Inside, the heater clicked again. Nia reached into the second bag and handed Lily the gallon of milk with both hands because it was heavy. She put the apples by the window where the light was best, set the bananas in the bowl, and lined the bread and peanut butter side by side on the little table as if neatness itself could make a meal feel bigger. Then she took off her gloves and began making sandwiches on paper towels, spreading the peanut butter all the way to the edges so no bite would taste like less. Edward stood across the parking lot near a row of ice street vending machines, watching through the thin gap in the curtain that had not fully closed. He saw Nia tear the bananas in half so there would be enough pieces for later. He saw Lily fold the new socks against her chest before setting them aside for Noah. He saw the boy take his first full breath through the spacer and then sit very still, as if his lungs were listening to a sound they had almost forgotten. And for the second time that day, in a place where no camera waited and no applause could reach, Edward felt the shape of his own life shift by one quiet inch. The room changed once food appeared. Not all at once, and not in some grand shining way, but in the small human ways that mattered more. The air still smelled faintly of old carpet and heater dust. The lamp still threw the same tired yellow light across the bedspread. The window still leaked cold around the edges where the seal had gone bad years ago. But now there was the soft sound of bread rustling from its plastic sleeve, the scrape of a butter knife against peanut butter, the round sweet smell of bananas warming in the room, and the careful quiet of children, trying not to rush what they had almost not had at all. Nia cut each sandwich into halves and set them on folded paper towels, one for Lily, one for Noah, one wrapped for later. She wiped the knife clean with the edge of the bread bag so none of the peanut butter would go to waste. Noah sat cross-legged on the bed, holding his half sandwich in both hands like he was waiting for permission from the world itself. Lily did not start eating either. She looked at Nia first. That was what made Edward, still unseen across the lot, stop pretending he was merely passing through. These children were hungry, clearly hungry, but they had learned some kind of grace around her. Not table manners. Not politeness drilled into them by adults with enough to spare. Something softer. The kind of pause people take when love has entered a room dressed as practicality. Go on, Nia said, smiling as she slid the banana pieces onto the cracked cereal bowl. Before the peanut butter changes its mind. Noah gave a tiny breath of laughter and took his first bite. Lily followed, slower, chewing carefully as if she wanted the food to last longer than food usually did. Nia stood by the folding table and watched them for a moment, then opened the milk and poured a little into the bowl they shared, measuring it with her eyes so there would still be some for morning. The little silver bell from her bike pressed against her coat pocket when she leaned forward. She felt it there and straightened at once. Lily noticed. She always noticed more than adults gave her credit for. Did you walk here? She asked. Nia nodded. Yes. Lily took another small bite, then looked toward the parking lot outside where children in other rooms had once left scooters and bikes near the rails in better months. Where is your red bike? She asked quietly. For a second the room held still. Even the heater seemed to pause between clicks. Nia reached for the bananas and arranged them again, though they did not need arranging. I do not have it anymore, she said. Noah looked up, confused. Did it break? Nia smiled in a way that did not quite reach her eyes. No. It helped. That answer was enough for Noah, but not for Lily. 10-year-old girls who had slept in motels and laundromats and once in the back seat of an aunt's car learned to hear what adults and children tried not to say. She set down the second half of her sandwich and looked at the socks folded beside her. You sold it, did you not? Nia did not answer right away. She picked up the empty bread bag, folded it into a square, and placed it neatly in the trash can by the sink. When she turned back, Lily was still watching her. So was Noah now. There was no point pretending with children who understood sacrifice before multiplication tables. Yes, Nia said. But it is all right. Lily frowned, not dramatic, just wounded in a quiet way. That was your only bike. Nia sat on the edge of the chair by the window and rubbed her palms together for warmth. And Noah needed to breathe easier tonight. So that made it the right thing. Noah lowered his sandwich. I can give it back, he said at once, reaching toward the spacer kit as if generosity could be reversed by willing it hard enough. Nia shook her head and leaned forward. No, baby. You use that. That is what it is for. Noah's eyes dropped to his lap. Lily stared at her for another long second, then asked the question Nia had known was coming the moment she handed over the first bag. What about you? It was such a small sentence, only 3 words, but it landed heavier than anything else in the room. What about your walk home? What about your father's gift? What about tomorrow morning when the city feels farther? What about the part of your life that was yours before you turned it into help for somebody else? Nia looked at the window where the thin curtain shifted against the draft. Outside, a shopping cart rattled faintly somewhere near the alley. A dog barked twice and stopped. Across the parking lot, the tall man in the navy coat had not moved. She reached into her pocket and touched the little silver bell with one finger, then let her hand fall. "I walked before I had wheels," she said softly. Lily's face changed at that. Not into a smile. Into something older than that. Respect, maybe. Or sorrow wearing respect's coat. She got up, crossed the room, and set the thick new socks back on the bed with care. Then she pulled one of the paper towels closer and folded the untouched half sandwich toward Nia. "Then you should eat before you walk again," she said. Nia opened her mouth to refuse, but before she could, the office door across the parking lot swung open and Mrs. Alvarez stepped out into the cold, one hand braced on the railing, her sharp eyes already fixed on room 112. Mrs. Alvarez crossed the parking lot with the clipped, fast steps of a woman who had spent too many years trying to hold together places that were always one unpaid bill away from falling apart. Her maroon office sweater was buttoned all the way up despite the wind, and the ring of keys at her waist made a dry metallic sound with each step. By the time she reached room 112, Lily had already gone still, Noah had lowered his sandwich into his lap, and Nia was rising from the chair by the window with the folded paper towel still in her hand. Mrs. Alvarez did not knock. She pushed the door wider with two fingers and stood in the frame, letting cold air slip in around her legs. Her eyes moved over the room quickly, catching on the milk, the bread, the apples by the window, the socks on the bed, and then finally on Nia. "Where did all this come from?" she asked. Her voice was not loud, but it had that hard motel office sharpness to it, the tone adults used when they were already halfway to the wrong conclusion. Nia opened her mouth to answer, but Lily spoke first. "She brought it for us." Mrs. Alvarez looked back at the table, then at the medicine near Noah, and something tightened in her face rather than softened. "With what money?" she asked. Noah shifted under the hoodie and glanced toward Nia as if waiting for the room to decide whether kindness was allowed to stay. Nia kept her hands at her sides. "I bought it," she said. "For them." Mrs. Alvarez gave a short breath through her nose, not quite a laugh and not quite disbelief, but close enough to both to sting. "You are 9 years old." Her eyes narrowed at the food again. Children do not just walk around buying groceries and medicine. Unless some adult put them up to it. Nia felt heat rise under her skin, not from guilt, but from the familiar helplessness of being small in front of grown people who had already written the ending before hearing the story. She thought of the red schwinn under the canvas cloth at Mr. Kaplan's shop, of the silver bell in her pocket, of Noah taking that first easier breath only minutes ago. The room suddenly felt much colder than it had before. "No one put me up to anything," she said quietly. Mrs. Alvarez stepped farther in, one hand resting on the door as though she might need leverage to hold the whole scene in place. "Then tell me how you paid for this." Nia hesitated, and that was enough to make the woman's expression harden. She reached for one of the grocery bags sitting empty near the bed and lifted it by the handle as if inspecting evidence. "Because from where I am standing, this looks a whole lot like something I am going to have to explain if the wrong person asks questions. Food. Medicine. New socks. For children in one of my rooms. And no parent in sight." Lily stood up so fast the bed frame gave a tiny squeak. "It is ours," she said. "She got it for us." Mrs. Alvarez turned to her, not cruel, but tired in the dangerous way tired adults sometimes became. "That is exactly what worries me." Noah's fingers tightened on the sandwich until peanut butter pressed against the crust. Nia took one step forward. "Please do not take it," she said. That sentence changed the room more than if she had cried. She did not sound dramatic. She sounded careful. Careful the way children sounded when they had already learned that pleading too hard could make adults feel powerful instead of kind. Mrs. Alvarez looked at her fully then, at the frayed ribbon, the damp hem of the coat, the shoes darkened by slush, and the small straight posture that seemed to be holding up more than a child should have had to hold. "I am not trying to be mean," she said, though the words did not soften what came next. "But charity does not fix poverty, little girl. And sometimes people who hand things out are not helping as much as they think. Nia glanced toward Noah, who had gone pale with worry again, and then toward Lily, who was standing very still with her chin lifted as if she understood humiliation well enough to recognize it even before it spoke. Nia reached into her coat pocket and curled her fingers around the little silver bell. "Maybe not," she said, her voice barely above the sound of the struggling heater. "But dinner helps tonight." For one long second, Mrs. Alvarez did not answer. Outside, a gust of wind sent a loose paper cup skittering across the asphalt. Somewhere near the ice machine, a door slammed and then the parking lot went quiet again. Across from room 112, Edward Whitmore stood half-shadowed near the vending machines, listening to a child defend the value of one meal as if the whole moral weight of the world had been left in her hands. Mrs. Alvarez looked back at the sandwiches, at the medicine, at the socks folded with such care, and her jaw shifted as though some old private argument had just started up inside her. But when she spoke again, her voice stayed guarded. "I need to know where this came from," she said. "All of it." Nia lifted her eyes to meet hers. They were steady now, though the tips of her fingers were cold against the bell in her pocket. "Then I will tell you," she said. "But do not make Noah give back the medicine first." "I sold my bike," Nia said, and the words fell into the room with a softness that somehow made them hit harder. Mrs. Alvarez did not speak for a moment. The heater clicked. The lamp buzzed faintly. Outside, a city bus sighed at the corner and moved on. Noah looked from Nia to the medicine on the bed and then back to Nia again, as if trying to understand how one thing had turned into the other. Lily already understood. Edward Whitmore, still standing across the lot near the Ice Street vending machines, understood too, but not in the way the child in room 112 did. He understood it as a man who had spent years writing checks without ever feeling the shape of what had been surrendered before the ink dried. Mrs. Alvarez let the empty plastic bag slip from her hand. It made a thin crackling sound as it landed on the carpet. "Your bike," she repeated. "The red one you ride through here in the summer." Nia nodded once. Her finger stayed inside her coat pocket, pressed around the little silver bell like it might steady her if the room tipped. "Mr. Kaplan at the pawn shop gave me $50, she said. "I made a list first so I would not spend it wrong." Mrs. Alvarez blinked, and for the first time since stepping into the room, she looked less suspicious than tired. Tired in the deep, old way that came from seeing too much need and having too little to stop it. "Does your mother know?" she asked. Nia looked down at the scuffed toe of her sneaker. That was answer enough. The motel manager exhaled slowly and rubbed 2 fingers over her forehead. "Oh, honey." It was the first kind thing she had said, and somehow that made Nia's throat tighten more than the sharp questions had. She swallowed it back. She had not sold the bike to cry about it in front of people. Lily moved closer until her shoulder almost touched Nia's coat sleeve. Noah slid off the bed and stood beside the little table, one hand resting near the medicine as if guarding it with his whole 7-year-old body. Mrs. Alvarez looked at the food again, then at the children, then back at Nia. "You should not have had to do that," she said, and this time the sentence was not accusation. It was grief dressed in plain clothes. Nia lifted one shoulder a little. But they needed dinner now. The room went quiet after that. Quiet in the way winter rooms did when everyone inside was thinking about things too large for the size of the walls. Through the gap in the curtain, pale afternoon light cut across the carpet and touched the white socks folded on the bed. Mrs. Alvarez stepped farther inside and picked up the spacer kit, turning it over carefully as if the plastic itself might explain what kind of child would trade away something precious for a chance to help another breathe easier. "Noah has been wheezing since last night," Lily said softly. She knew what to get. Mrs. Alvarez gave a slow nod, then set the kit back exactly where she had found it. When she looked at Nia again, the hard office tone was gone from her face. In its place was something more dangerous to a proud little heart. Respect. "Did you walk all the way here carrying this?" she asked. Nia nodded. "From Fulton." Mrs. Alvarez glanced at the damp hem of her coat, the reddened fingers, the way the child was standing straight only because she had decided to. "And you were going to walk home too?" Nia gave the smallest smile. "Yes, Marem." Across the lot, Edward lowered his gaze for a second, suddenly aware of the warmth of his own wool coat, the leather gloves in his pocket, the black SUV idling half a block away because his driver had been told to stay close. Everything in his life arrived before he had to need it. This girl had walked into the cold carrying dinner in both hands and left nothing for herself except the bell from a bicycle she no longer owned. Mrs. Alvarez leaned against the doorframe and looked older than she had 5 minutes before. "I still do not like children fixing what adults should be fixing," she said quietly. "But I am not taking any of this out of this room." Noah let out a breath so relieved it almost sounded like a laugh. Lily closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them again. Nia did not smile this time. She just nodded, serious as ever, as if mercy was something to accept respectfully and not celebrate too soon. Mrs. Alvarez reached into the pocket of her sweater, pulled out a small motel meal voucher stamped for the diner across the street, and placed it on the table beside the apples. "For your walk home," she said. Nia started to refuse, but the woman lifted a hand. "No speeches. Just take it." Nia looked at the voucher, then at Mrs. Alvarez, then down at the silver bell hidden in her pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. The manager turned toward the door, paused, and looked back once more at the child standing there in a brown coat with cold hands and an empty space where a red bike used to be. "Your mother is going to need to know," she said. Nia's eyes flickered, just once. Outside, Edward Whitmore straightened at the same moment, because from the way the room had gone still again, he understood 2 things at once. The first was that the little girl had not gone home yet. The second was that when she did, the hardest part of her day was still waiting for her there. By the time Nia left Maple Crest, the light had gone thin and blue, the kind of late winter light that made every puddle look colder than it was. Mrs. Alvarez had pressed the diner voucher into her hand, but Nia folded it carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket untouched. She could not make herself trade kindness for a grilled cheese when Lily and Noah were still dividing apples on a motel bed behind her. The little silver bell from her bike knocked softly against the paper voucher each time she walked, 2 small reminders of what the day had cost and what it had not fixed. Across the parking lot, Edward Whitmore watched her step through the gate and head west along Fulton, shoulders tucked against the wind, her stride steady even though she had been carrying other people's needs since morning. For one brief second he considered crossing the street, offering a ride, saying something simple and civilized. But something in the way she walked stopped him. Pride, maybe. Or dignity so young it should have still been protected instead of tested. He stayed where he was and watched until she disappeared past the laundromat with the flickering open sign, then turned toward his waiting driver with a face that had gone quieter than before. Nia reached her apartment building just after 5:30, when the hallway lights had already come on and the old radiator in the front stairwell hissed like it was arguing with the cold outside. The Brooks apartment was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a narrow corridor that always smelled faintly of bleach, onions, and somebody else's laundry soap. She slowed at the door. Usually the red Schwinn would be leaning against the wall beside the coat rack in the little entryway, the front tire leaving a faint half-moon of dirt on the linoleum no matter how carefully she wiped it down. Tonight there would be only empty floor. Nia stood there for a long second with the key in her hand, feeling the shape of that absence before she stepped into it. Inside, the apartment was small but neat. The kitchen light was on. A pot sat on the stove with a lid rattling gently from steam, and the radio on the counter played low gospel under the hum of the refrigerator. Her mother, Marlene Brooks, was still in her navy scrubs from the assisted living center, one sneaker kicked off beneath the table, a stack of unpaid envelopes spread beside her like a hand of bad cards. She looked up the moment Nia came in, and the relief on her face arrived first, before anything else could. "Baby, there you are. I was about to call Mrs. Jenkins downstairs." Then her eyes moved past Nia toward the hall behind her, searching for the familiar red frame that did not follow. Relief left her face so quickly it almost felt like a door shutting. "Where is your bike?" The question was simple. That was what made it heavy. Nia closed the door carefully so it would not slam. She took off her coat one sleeve at a time and hung it on the hook by the sink, buying herself 3 extra seconds that did not help. Marlene was already standing now, one hand flat on the table, the other still holding a bill she had forgotten to put down. Nia. Her daughter looked at the empty patch of linoleum near the wall where the bike should have been. I sold it, she said. The kitchen went still except for the pot lid clicking softly on the stove. Marlene did not raise her voice. That would have been easier, somehow. She just stared, her tired face suddenly losing all expression, like pain had pulled the light out of it from the inside. You did what? Nia swallowed. I sold it to Mr. Kaplan at the pawn shop. Marlene set the bill on the table with slow, careful fingers. Why? Nia's hand moved instinctively to her coat pocket where the bell and the folded voucher rested together. Some kids at Maple Crest needed food, she said. And Noah needed medicine to help him breathe. Her mother closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them again, they were wet but steady. Baby, that bike was your father's gift to you. Nia nodded, because that was the whole wound. The one fact she had not forgotten for a single minute all day. Marlene pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down hard, not dramatic, just tired in her bones. On the refrigerator door above her hung a photograph held up by a magnet shaped like a peach. In it, Nia was 6 and grinning with 2 front teeth missing, one hand on the red handlebars while her father crouched beside her in his Orioles cap, smiling like he had built the whole summer with his own hands. Marlene looked at that picture now, then back at her daughter. Why would you sell the last thing he gave you without talking to me first? Nia's throat tightened so fast it hurt. She had been brave in the pawn shop, brave in the market, brave in the motel room, brave under Mrs. Alvarez's questions. But home was different. Home was where truth stopped sounding noble and started sounding expensive. Because they were hungry now, she whispered. And I knew you would try to find another way, but there was not time. Marlene pressed her lips together and looked down at her own hands. The skin around her knuckles was dry from sanitizer and long shifts. You are 9 years old, she said softly. You should not be choosing between memories and medicine. Nia stood very still by the sink, her eyes burning. The pot lid rattled again. The radio kept singing low and faithful in the corner. And in that small kitchen, with unpaid bills on the table and one red bicycle missing from the wall, both mother and daughter finally understood the same terrible thing at the same time. The child had done the right thing. That was what made it hurt. That night the apartment seemed smaller than usual, as if the missing bicycle had taken more with it than space by the wall. Marlene turned off the stove without serving herself much dinner and moved through the kitchen in the quiet, efficient way she used when her heart was too full and there was still work to do. She packed half the soup into a plastic container for tomorrow, stacked the bills into a crooked pile, and wiped the counter twice even though it was already clean. Nia sat at the table with her spoon in her hand and hardly ate. The radio had gone silent. In its place came the ordinary sounds of the building settling around them, a television murmuring through the wall next door, footsteps in the upstairs hallway, the old radiator knocking now and then like it was trying to say something no one wanted to hear. Marlene finally sat across from her daughter, still in her navy scrubs, shoulders bowed with the weight of a long shift and a longer life. For a while she just looked at Nia, really looked at her, at the small face trying so hard to stay brave, at the coat hanging by the sink, at the empty place by the wall where red paint should have caught the kitchen light. I am not angry because you were kind, she said at last. Her voice was tired, but gentle now. I am angry because you thought you had to carry something this big by yourself. Nia lowered her eyes to the table. The wood grain blurred for a second before she blinked it clear again. I did not want Noah to wait, she whispered. Marlene nodded once, slowly, like the sentence hurt because it made too much sense. I know. She reached across the table and laid her hand over Nia's small one. Her palm was warm and dry and roughened by sanitizer, by work, by years of caring for people who needed help whether the world paid enough for that care or not. But being good should not cost a child her father twice. That was the sentence that broke the last of Nia's composure. Not loudly. Not in some wild rush. Just a soft collapse inside her chest that reached her eyes all at once. She covered her mouth with her free hand and cried the way children cry when they are trying not to make a burden out of their feelings, shoulders shaking, breath catching, tears slipping through anyway. Marlene stood up at once and came around the table, pulling Nia gently into her arms. Nia pressed her face into the side of her mother's scrub top and let the grief come. It was not only for the bike. It was for the parking lot where her father had run beside her. For the streamers on the handlebars. For the fact that doing the right thing had felt so certain in the morning and so expensive by night. Marlene held her close and smoothed a hand over her braids. "Listen to me," she murmured into the top of her daughter's head. "What you did was loving. It was brave. But next time, you bring me into the hard part too. Do you hear me?" Nia nodded against her, unable to speak for a moment. Later, after dishes were rinsed and the kitchen light switched off, she lay in bed with the blanket pulled to her chin and the little silver bell cupped in both hands beneath the covers. Moonlight from the street lamp outside drew pale bars across her bedroom wall. On the dresser sat a framed photo of her father holding the red Schwinn steady while she laughed up at him, one sneaker off the pedal, not quite balanced yet. Nia turned the bell over with her thumb until she found the tiny scratch near the screw where his pocketknife had slipped the day he tightened it for her. She pressed that scratch to her fingertip and shut her eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered into the dark. "I really am." In the silence that followed, she imagined what he might have said, not in words exactly, but in the shape of him, the patient smile, the way he always cared more about who she was becoming than what she owned. In another part of the city, far above the harbor lights, Edward Whitmore stood alone in the window of his penthouse study with his tie loosened and his gala briefing folder untouched on the desk behind him. Below, Baltimore glittered in cold neat lines, all glass and distance and money pretending it knew the whole map of need. But all Edward could see was a child in a brown coat saying dinner helps tonight, and another child in a motel room touching new socks like they were made of grace. He had attended 100 fundraisers. He had been thanked in ballrooms, photographed beside giant checks, praised for vision, generosity, impact. Yet none of it had lodged beneath his ribs the way one sold bicycle had. Near midnight, while Nia finally drifted into an uneasy sleep with the silver bell still in her hand, Edward reached for his phone, looked at the gala schedule glowing on the screen, and for the first time in years felt ashamed of how polished mercy could become when no one had to give up the thing they loved to prove they meant it. The next morning arrived silver and thin, with frost feathering the corners of the Brooks apartment window and the city. Sounding far away under the hush of early traffic. Nia woke before her alarm, still curled around the little bicycle bell in her hand. For one confused second she thought she had fallen asleep after polishing the red handlebars like she used to on Saturdays, but then her fingers closed around the cold metal scratch near the screw and memory came back all at once. The empty place by the wall. Her mother's face at the kitchen table. The photograph on the refrigerator. She lay still beneath the blanket and stared at the pale ceiling until she heard Marlene moving in the kitchen, opening cabinets softly so the day would not start too hard. By the time Nia padded out in her socks, her mother had packed her lunch in the old purple lunch sack with the broken zipper and set a bowl of oatmeal on the table. Marlene looked tired, but the sharp hurt from the night before had settled into something quieter now, something deeper and gentler. She smoothed a hand over Nia's shoulder as she passed. "Eat while it is warm," she said. Nia nodded and sat down. The oatmeal tasted like cinnamon and not much else, but the warmth helped. On the chair beside her, her coat pocket still held the folded diner voucher from Mrs. Alvarez. Marlene noticed it when she picked up the coat to shake it out. "What is this?" she asked. Nia explained in a low voice, careful not to make the story sound bigger than it was. "Mrs. Alvarez. The motel. The food. The medicine. The voucher." Marlene listened without interrupting, then tucked the paper back into the pocket and said, "You keep that. There is no shame in accepting care when it is offered kindly." Nia lowered her eyes and stirred the last of the oatmeal. That sentence stayed with her as she got dressed for school. Outside, the air had the clean, sharp bite of a Baltimore winter morning, the kind that made every breath feel like glass for the first 2 blocks. Nia zipped her coat to the chin and started toward school on foot, the silver bell resting against her palm inside her pocket. Walking felt strange at first. Her body kept expecting the old rhythm of pedals, the light lift over cracked sidewalks, the little ring of the bell at corners where people drifted too slowly. Now there was only the soft scrape of her sneakers on salted pavement and the city waking up around her in layers. A corner bakery breathing out warm yeast and sugar. A bus kneeling at the curb with a hiss. A crossing guard stamping her boots and blowing into gloved hands. Nia kept her head down and walked faster. She was halfway past the vacant lot near Carey Street when she heard someone calling her name in a small, breathless voice. Nia! Wait! She turned. Noah Price was hurrying toward her from the direction of Maple Crest, bundled in a coat too thin for the weather, his hood half off and one shoe untied. Mrs. Alvarez was behind him at a slower pace, calling for him not to run. Nia's heart jumped. For one terrible second she thought something had gone wrong in the night, that the medicine had not helped, that Lily had sent him because there was some new emergency. But when Noah reached her, he was breathing hard from effort, not panic. Hard, but not wheezing. Not pulling air like it had thorns in it. Just breathing. He stopped in front of her and pressed a folded piece of notebook paper into her hand with mittenless fingers gone pink from the cold. Lily wrote it because my letters go crooked when I hurry, he said. Nia looked down and opened the paper carefully. In thick pencil, uneven but determined, the note said, I did not wheeze last night. I slept all the way until morning. Thank you for the medicine and the banana with freckles. Below the words was a drawing of a smiling stick figure on a bicycle with a bell bigger than its head. Nia read the line twice, then once more, and the wind, the cold, the missing bike, all of it seemed to pull back for a moment and leave only that one simple miracle standing in the street between them. Noah touched his chest with his gloved hand as if checking it again for proof. I only woke up one time, he said proudly. Mrs. Alvarez finally reached them, slightly out of breath, a knit hat pulled low over her dark hair. She looked from Noah to Nia and then to the note in the child's hand. He insisted, she said, not apologizing for it. The minute he got up, he said he had to tell you before school. Nia folded the note with slow care and slipped it into the same pocket as the silver bell. Her eyes burned a little in the cold, but she smiled anyway, small and real. I am glad you slept, she whispered. Noah grinned, and this time the grin reached all the way into his breathing. Across town, in a glass office high above the harbor, Edward Whitmore stood at the head of a polished conference table while 2 assistants waited with tablets full of gala schedules and donor confirmations. He looked at the seating chart on the screen for exactly 3 seconds before hearing again in his mind the calm voice of a little girl saying dinner helps tonight. Then he looked up and said something that made both assistants freeze where they stood. Cancel the luncheon, he said. And clear my afternoon. We are doing this differently. The room on the 32nd floor went still in the polished, expensive way rooms did when no one was used to hearing the plan change. Edward Whitmore stood at the end of the conference table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than a month of rent at Maple Crest, one hand resting on the back of a leather chair, the harbor spread out behind him in cold blue glass. Across from him, 2 assistants sat with tablets glowing in their hands, and his events director, Pamela Reese, had a printed gala schedule marked in gold pen all the way down to the dessert course. Winter Radiance was supposed to be the Whitmore Foundation event of the season. There would be a string quartet under crystal light, silver place cards, camera crews, and donor names arranged like royalty around the ballroom at the Grand Meridian. Edward had approved every detail 2 weeks earlier. Now he looked at the seating chart for another second, then pushed it gently aside. We are not doing this, he said. Pamela blinked once, waiting for the part where he clarified that only the flowers were changing or the keynote speaker had cancelled. Not doing which part? She asked carefully. Edward met her eyes. Any of it. One of the assistants nearly dropped his stylus. Pamela straightened in her chair. Edward, the gala is tomorrow night. The venue is paid. The chef has already prepped. The press list is confirmed. We have raised pledges tied to this event. Edward turned toward the window for a moment, looking down at the city in neat winter blocks, at streets where people with real need were already awake and moving while his foundation debated centerpiece heights. He thought of Nia Brooke standing in a pawn shop with a pencil list in her hand. He thought of the notebook paper in Noah's mitten, of the words "I did not wheeze last night." Then he turned back. How much are we spending on the ballroom, the staging, the custom lighting, the floral installations, the valet team, the after-dinner entertainment, the branded photo wall, and the donor gifts? Pamela hesitated. Around $840,000 before the matching pledges come in. Edward let the number settle over the table like dust no one wanted to breathe. $840,000, he repeated. To discuss helping children. No one answered. Outside the glass, a gull dipped over the harbor and disappeared. I want every dollar not already legally unrecoverable redirected today, he said. Emergency housing support. Food access. Pediatric respiratory care. Transportation grants. Quiet delivery, no press release. Pamela stared at him. You cannot be serious. Edward's expression did not change. I have never been more serious. She flipped open the folder with sharper movements now, scanning pages as if paperwork might save the old plan. Our donors expect a visible event. They expect stewardship. They expect to be seen giving, Edward said, not loudly, but with enough truth in it to stop the room. That is not the same thing. Silence followed, brittle and expensive. His younger assistant, Jonah, looked from one face to another like he had wandered into a storm in office shoes. Pamela lowered the folder slowly. What brought this on? She asked. Edward could have lied. He could have said strategy. Efficiency. New priorities. But some part of him, the part a 9-year-old had embarrassed simply by being decent, was too tired for polished language. Yesterday I watched a little girl sell the only bicycle she had so another child could eat and breathe easier that night, he said. She did more actual good with $50 than this foundation is about to do with a ballroom full of speeches. Jonah's mouth parted slightly. Pamela looked stunned, then unsettled, then thoughtful in spite of herself. Edward walked back to the table and tapped the gala budget packet with one finger. I built this foundation because after my wife died I needed to believe money could still behave like love if it was organized well enough. Somewhere along the way it became performance. I am finished performing. The words stayed in the room after he said them, heavy and human and far less polished than anything his staff was used to hearing. Pamela looked down at the gold-marked pages in front of her, then at the spreadsheet on her tablet, then back at him. If we do this, she said slowly, people are going to talk. Edward gave the faintest nod. Good. Let them. He moved toward the head of the table again, already making decisions with the steadiness of a man who had finally found the one thing more uncomfortable than disruption, his own conscience. Jonah, I want a full list of every family currently housed at Maple Crest Motel and any other temporary stay sites receiving no foundation support. Work through community partners, not city cameras. Pamela, call the Grand Meridian and cancel everything that can be cancelled. The rest gets reproposed. Prepared meals go out tonight. Floral budget becomes grocery cards. Entertainment budget becomes asthma medication grants and school transit assistance. I want implementation before lunch, not applause by dinner. Jonah nodded at once, almost with relief. Pamela did not move for a beat, then closed the gala folder with both hands and stood. Something in her face had shifted, not into agreement exactly, but into recognition. All right, she said. If we are doing it, we do it right. Edward looked once more out at the city, at the winter light lying pale over rooftops and row houses and motel lots no gala guest would ever see. For the first time in years, the money in his name felt less like a shield and more like a responsibility with sharp edges. Somewhere across town, Nia Brooks was probably sitting in a classroom with the silver bell from her bicycle tucked safe in her pocket, not knowing that a room full of adults in tailored clothes had just rearranged an entire night because one child had refused to let hunger wait. By late afternoon, the Whitmore Foundation offices no longer looked like a place preparing for a gala. The flower order was gone. The string quartet had been cancelled. The polished event binders lay closed in a neat stack on Pamela Reese's desk while phones rang in every corner of the floor with a different kind of urgency now, one that had nothing to do with seating charts. Grocery cards were being printed. Pediatric clinics were being called. Community partners who had spent years filling gaps with too little and too late suddenly found themselves hearing words they almost never heard from major donors. Yes, today. No cameras. Tell us what is needed first. Edward Whitmore moved through it all without his coat on, tie loosened, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, looking less like a man directing philanthropy and more like someone trying to catch up to a truth he should have reached years ago. Just after 4, Jonah stepped into his office with a file folder and a look that said the day had stopped being ordinary even by new standards. I found the shop, he said. Kaplan Pawn and Trade on Fulton. The bike is still there. The owner kept it off the floor because you asked. Edward looked up from the housing support report in his hands. For the first time all day, something softened in his face. Good, he said. Call the best restoration mechanic in the city. Not someone who makes old things look new. Someone who knows how to make them whole without erasing what they have been through. Jonah nodded, then hesitated. There is more. Maple Crest Motel is 3 months behind on taxes. The property owner has been trying to sell quietly. Half the rooms are occupied by families in transitional housing limbo. Edward took the folder from him and skimmed the first page. Turquoise railings. Deferred maintenance. Unstable ownership. Children living by the week. A long pause followed. Then he set the paper down and said, start the acquisition process through the housing arm. Immediate repairs, legal support for residents, and a plan for long-term transition. Keep the families in place. No one gets displaced to make a project look clean. Jonah gave one short nod, the kind people gave when they realized the thing being asked was large but right. And the name, he asked before he could stop himself. Edward looked toward the harbor, then back at the folder. Not mine, he said. We will know the name when we earn it. Across town, in the warm back corner of a bike repair shop that smelled like chain oil, rubber, and old coffee, a grey-bearded mechanic named Ray Donnelly lifted the red Schwinn onto a stand and ran one careful hand along the frame. He listened while Jonah explained what mattered. Keep the old color. Save the silver streamers if possible. Leave a tiny scratch by the bell mount. Do not polish away the life from it. Ray glanced over his glasses and said, so this is not about making it worth more. Jonah thought of a little girl in a brown coat and answered honestly. No. It is about making it feel like it came home. Ray got to work. He tightened spokes, checked brake lines, replaced what safety required, and cleaned the red paint slowly enough to let the years still show through. He found matching ribbon for the streamers but kept the one faded strand that had survived, knotting it back into the new with the care of a man repairing more than metal. When he finished near dusk, the bike did not shine like a showroom floor. It looked better than that. It looked remembered. At Maple Crest, the first practical signs of change arrived before anyone had language for them. A van from a local grocer unloaded fresh produce into the office. 2 volunteers carried boxes of shelf-stable food into an empty laundry room Mrs. Alvarez had quietly agreed could become a temporary pantry. A respiratory nurse contracted through a neighborhood clinic came by with proper inhaler spacers, child masks, and printed instructions in both English and Spanish. Lily watched all this from the walkway outside room 112 with Noah beside her. His hood pulled up, his breathing easy enough now that he kept forgetting to guard it. Mrs. Alvarez stood near the office steps with a clipboard she had borrowed for the occasion, though her eyes looked more stunned than organized. Who is paying for all this? She asked the nurse under her breath. The woman checked a delivery form and answered, the Whitmore Foundation, apparently. Mrs. Alvarez let out a quiet breath through her nose. Apparently, she repeated, as if the word itself could not hold the shape of what she was seeing. That evening, Marlene Brooks returned from her shift to find a voicemail she almost ignored because the number was unfamiliar and she was too tired to want anything from strangers. But something in the calm male voice made her sit down at the kitchen table before she played it a second time. "Mr. Whitmore," it said. "I would like to speak with you about your daughter, not to trouble her, but because I believe she reminded me how to behave like a human being." Marlene stared at the phone for a long moment after the message ended, the kitchen quiet around her except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint city noise beyond the window. In the bedroom, Nia was already asleep over her homework, cheek resting on her math workbook, one hand tucked under the pillow where the silver bell lay hidden. Outside, winter pressed its cold face to the glass. Across Baltimore, under porch lights and street lamps and the pale wash of parking lot fixtures, food was being carried into rooms that had grown used to waiting, medicine was being handed to parents who had long since stopped expecting quick help, and in the back of a black SUV heading toward the Brooks apartment just after sunset, Edward Whitmore sat beside a restored red bicycle and a folded property brief for Maple Crest, knowing that before this night was over he intended to return one. Child's wheels and change the ground beneath many others. When the black SUV pulled up outside the Brooks apartment building, the street was already washed in the amber glow of winter evening, and the cold had settled into the curb like it planned to stay all night. Edward Whitmore stepped out first, his coat buttoned high, one hand resting on the red Schwinn as the driver lowered it carefully from the back. Under the street lamp, the paint looked almost exactly as it had in the old photograph on Marlene's refrigerator, not brand new, not polished into something false, but loved back into readiness. The silver streamers stirred in the wind. The little mount where the bell belonged still held the tiny scratch near the screw. Edward stood there for a moment with one gloved hand on the handlebar, suddenly aware that all the money in his life had never once made him as nervous as knocking on a poor woman's door with her daughter's bicycle. Marlene opened it after the second knock, still in her scrubs, her face guarded from habit before recognition slowly replaced it. For a second she only stared at the bike behind him. Then her hand rose to her mouth. Edward removed his gloves, not out of etiquette, but because this did not feel like a conversation to have with a barrier between skin and truth. "Mrs. Brooks," he said gently, "I am Edward Whitmore. I am sorry to come unannounced." Marlene's eyes moved from his face to the red bike and back again. "You are the one who called," she said. He nodded. "I am." Inside the apartment, a floorboard creaked. Small footsteps followed. Nia appeared at the end of the narrow hall in her socks, sleepy-eyed and quiet, one hand still holding the silver bell she had kept beneath her pillow. She saw Edward first, then the bicycle beyond him, and stopped so suddenly the hallway seemed to stop with her. The room went still. No one rushed to fill it. The old radiator knocked once. A car passed below the window. Nia walked forward slowly, as if quick movement might scare the moment away. When she reached the doorway, she looked not at Edward, not at her mother, but straight at the bike. Her fingers lifted, hesitant at first, then touched the red handlebar grip. She found the scratch near the bell mount immediately, as if grief had memorized it better than joy ever could. Then she opened her hand and showed Edward the little silver bell. "I kept it," she whispered. Something in Edward's face gave way then, some polished piece of himself that had been trained for boardrooms and donor dinners but not for children carrying proof of love in their palms. "I hoped you had," he said. Nia stepped onto the stoop in the cold without seeming to feel it. With careful fingers she fitted the bell back in place and tightened the screw as far as she could. Ray Donnelly had left it loose on purpose so the child could be the one to finish bringing it home. When the bell finally sat right against the handlebar, Nia touched it once. The sound that rang out was small and bright and impossibly ordinary, and yet it seemed to move through every part of that winter evening like light through thin glass. Marlene closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them again, they were wet. Edward looked at both of them and chose not to hide behind foundation language. "Your daughter changed something in me yesterday," he said. "I watched her give up the only thing she had that was truly hers so someone else could eat and breathe easier. I have spent years funding help from a distance. She reminded me that distance can become an excuse. Marlene said nothing at first. She rested one hand on the doorframe like she needed the support of something steady. Edward reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded sheet of cream paper. This is not a publicity piece, he said. There will be no cameras. But tonight food and medical support have already gone to Maple Crest, and by morning the process will begin to purchase the property, repair it, and convert the site into stable transitional housing with a pantry, tutoring rooms, and pediatric support on site. Marlene blinked slowly, like the words were too large to trust all at once. Nia looked up from the bike for the first time. Because of the motel, she asked. Edward shook his head. Because of what you taught me about what help is supposed to feel like. He held out the paper then. Marlene took it and unfolded it under the kitchen light spilling through the doorway. At the top was a simple heading, no logo larger than the words beneath it. Proposed community name, the Brooks Children's House. Marlene's eyes moved over the page, then to her daughter, then back to Edward. Brooks, she asked softly. Edward gave the smallest nod. Not because you need to be displayed, he said. Because generosity should remember where it learned its name. Nia stood very still, one mittenless hand resting on the bicycle seat, the other on the bell she had just returned to its place. She did not squeal. She did not throw herself into anyone's arms. She only looked at the red bike, then passed it into the street where the cold air shimmered under the lamp, and finally back at the man who had arrived in a dark car and somehow chosen to leave more human than he came. The next morning, long before the city had fully warmed, trucks rolled into Maple Crest with lumber, fresh paint, groceries, and folding bookshelves. Mrs. Alvarez stood in the lot with her clipboard forgotten at her side. Lily and Noah watched from the walkway, Noah breathing easy enough to laugh at the steam coming out of his mouth. On the office wall, where the vacancy sign had once flickered weakly against peeling paint, workers lifted a temporary whiteboard with plain black letters and bolted it into place. The Brooks Children's House. Across the lot, Nia arrived on her red Schwinn, pedaling slowly, the silver bell ringing once as she turned through the gate. She stopped in the pale morning sun and put one foot on the ground. Edward was standing near the new pantry door with his coat open and his hands in his pockets, but he did not wave for attention. He only looked at the child on the bicycle and then at the family stepping into a place that no longer looked like it was waiting to be forgotten. Nia rested her hand on the handlebar, feeling the familiar grip beneath her palm, hearing the quiet murmur of people carrying in food and books and folded blankets. The winter air still held its bite. The buildings were still old. The world had not turned soft overnight. But under the new sign, with the morning light caught on red paint and silver ribbon, one thing had changed for good. A little girl had given away her wheels, and in return, an entire place had learned how to move.